Hello, today I will read the book named Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Chapter 1. A New Arrival. For a long time after he had been delivered by the surgeon, who was on contract with the workhouse, the baby on the little mattress, struggling to take his first breath. Had there been anxious relatives hovering over him, maybe he would have died. But there was only an old pauper woman and the surgeon in attendance. The woman was fuzzy-headed from drinking the contents of a green bottle, which she did slyly in a corner of the room. The surgeon seemed more interested in warming his hands by the fire. The infant finally took a breath and gave a lasty cry. The pale young woman lying on the bed stirred and said weakly, stretching out her arms, "Let me see the baby and die." "Oh, you shouldn't talk of dying yet," said the surgeon in a surprisingly kind voice. "Yes," agreed the old woman. "Look at me. I had 13 children, although only 2 survived. Just think of what it is to be a mother," she said. She placed the baby in his mother's arms. The girl imprinted a kiss on his forehead with cold white lips, looked wildly around, shuddered, and then fell back dead. They tried to revive her by chafing her wrists and feet, but in vain. "It's all over, Mrs. Thingummy," said the surgeon. "Yes, poor dear," sighed the woman. "You must call me if it gives too much trouble. Give it some gruel if it cries," he said, pulling on his gloves. Then he paused while passing the bed. She was a good-looking girl. Who was she? "They found her lying in the street. Her shoes were all in tatters," replied Mrs. Thingummy. "The old story," he sighed, lifting her left hand and noting the absence of a wedding ring. He then put on his hat and went out. As long as the baby was wrapped in a blanket, it was difficult to say whether he was a child of a nobleman or a beggar. Now dressed in an old calico robe, yellowed and thinned with age, he was marked out as a workhouse orphan, destined to be half-starved and bullied throughout his life, hated by all and pitied by none. Chapter 2. Asking for more. Oliver Twist, as he was named by the beadle, Mr. Bumble, who had reached the alphabet O and T at that time, was farmed out to a Mrs. Mann, who was in charge of a branch workhouse in the country. The workhouse committee felt that she would provide Oliver the motherly care that he needed. The reality was very different. Although she was given a sum of money every week to buy food for the children and clothes for them, Mrs. Mann kept a part of it for herself. The children were perpetually hungry and cold, and many of them died. Oliver was made of sterner stuff and survived, a small, pale, thin boy. The day he celebrated his 9th birthday, Mr. Bumble came visiting. Oliver was now old enough to work. He was taken back to the workhouse, where he had been born, and set to picking oakum. He was more miserable here than at Mrs. Mann's. True, he had been ill-treated there, but he had made friends. Now he has thrown among a great crowd of boys of all ages. The bigger ones bullied the smaller ones mercilessly. The children were fed with gruel, a bowl of watery oatmeal progeny 3 times a day, relieved by an onion twice a week, and half a bread roll on Sundays. The bowls and hands never needed washing because the boys cleaned them off every speck of gruel with the spoons and licked their fingers besides. Then they would look with hungry eyes at the huge serving dish as if they would devour it if they could. They were never satisfied. One day, one of the big boys, who had a wild manner, threatened to eat the small boy who slept next to him if he wasn't given more growl. This terrified the little boys so much that they drew straws to see who would go up to the master and ask him for more. On poor Oliver fell the daunting task. The next day the boys finished the gruel, and whispering began. They pushed Oliver forward, and he walked with dragging steps towards the cook. He stood there with his bowl and spoon trembling and ashen-faced. The cook glowered down at him. "Please, sir, I want some more," he said in a hesitant voice. "What?" shrieked the cook. "What did you say?" "Please, sir, I want some more," repeated Oliver. "More? More?" shouted the cook, as if he had asked for the moon. "Mr. Bumble, come here at once. Oliver is asking for more." The cook seized Oliver by the collar of his raggedy shirt and twisted his ears. He aimed a bowl at him with a ladle. Mr. Bumble appeared and locked Oliver up alone in a dark, cold room as punishment. A notice was put up on the workhouse wall offering Oliver's services as an apprentice to any tradesman for £5. Oliver was thus apprenticed to an undertaker called Sowerberry. The first day of his new life, his supper consisted of the old bits of meat rejected by the dog. He fell upon it ravenously. His bed was made under a table in the room where coffins were stored. Oliver glanced around fearfully at the long dark shape, expecting a terrible form to rise up suddenly and smother him. Sowerberry's assistant was a thick-set, mean-looking charity boy named Noah Claypole. A charity boy was a step higher than an orphan because he had parents. Since they were too poor to bring up Noah, he was supported by charity. He thought himself superior to Oliver and loved to tease him, pulling his hair, pinching and showering him and addressing him as workers. Charlotte, the scullery maid, was in love with Noah and usually reserved the best bits of food for him while giving Oliver burnt or rancid leftovers. Oliver bore the ill treatment with a stoic face because he was used to being handled roughly all his life. Because of his delicate and melancholy good looks, he had been appointed as a mute by Sowerberry, specially for Kid's funeral. Dressed in a black cloak and a black top hat with a trailing black hatband, Oliver led the funeral processions wearing a sorrowful, solemn expression. In fact, Oliver made such a touching mute that mothers were unable to hold back their tears when they saw him. Noah was jealous that Oliver was in Sowerberry's favor, and his harassment increased. One day he said, "Workers, where's your mother?" "She is dead," Oliver replied, the color rising in his face. A strange expression flitted across his face. Noah thought that Oliver was about to burst into tears, and he was pleased. "What did she die of, Workers?" "Of a broken heart. That's what one of the nurses told me. I know what it must be like to die of that." "Oh, and what set you crying now, Workers?" continued Noah, when he saw a tear rolling down Oliver's cheek. "Not you," said Oliver fiercely, "and don't you dare say anything about my mother." "Dare? Dare?" said Noah with a sneer. "I bet she died because she was a bad one. And it was a good thing too, otherwise she might have gone to prison or been hanged." Crimson with fury, Oliver got up and punched Noah, knocking him down. He then proceeded to hit and kick him. "Master, Charlotte, mistress," howled Noah, "help! Oliver is trying to kill me." Oliver was half Noah's size, but anger gave him strength. He stood flushed and panting over his tormentor. Minutes ago he had been a cowed, dejected child, but the insult to his dead mother had awakened a dormant fire. Charlotte and Mrs. Sowerberry both let out a scream and rushed in. Charlotte began pummeling Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry added her blows, and Noah, now recovered, kicked him from behind. Eventually he was dragged screaming into the cellar, and the door banged shut on him. Oliver was unfazed and continued to beat at the door. Noah ran was tasked to summon Mr. Bumble from the workhouse. That pompous personage came and asked Oliver whether he was sorry for what he had done. "No, he deserved it. He insulted my mother," shouted Oliver. Sowerberry arrived, and having listened to the exaggerated accounts of Oliver's ferocity from his wife, Charlotte, and Noah, unlocked the cellar door and boxed his apprentice's ears. "Now you are a nice one, aren't you?" he said. "He called my mother names," said Oliver. "And what if he did, you ungrateful wretch?" said Mrs. Sowerberry. "She deserved it." "No, she didn't," replied Oliver. Sowerberry gave him a thrashing that even Mr. Bumble felt it was unnecessary for him to use his cane. Oliver was then banished to his bed in the coffin room with a piece of bread. As he climbed the stairs, Charlotte, Noah, and Mrs. Sowerberry called out jeering comments and sniggered loudly. Curled up in his little mattress under the counter, Oliver went to his grief. He sobbed wretchedly and long, wishing that he were dead and laid out in one of the coffins that surrounded him. He dried his tears and decided that he would run away. As soon as dawn streaked the sky with pink and gold, Oliver was up. He bundled his mere belongings and the piece of bread which he had been given for dinner. He opened the shop door quietly and looked left and right. Nothing was astir. Oliver stepped out and was soon on his way past the workhouse down the road. He remembered trading with Mr. Bumble. He would soon pass the cottage in which he had lived with Mrs. Hahn. His heart began to beat faster. He so wanted to meet Dick, a young orphan who had been his best friend. Luckily, he found the little boy up and working in the garden. "Dick," he called softly. "It's Oliver." Dick turned his pale face and then came running to the gate. "Oliver, I'm so glad to see you." "Shh, no one should hear you," Oliver said, putting his finger on his lips. "Dick, I'm running away. They treated me so badly. I'm going far away from here to make my fortune. I came to say goodbye. But why are you so pale?" "I overheard the doctor say I am dying. I am not sad. I think I will be happier in heaven, where I see kinder faces." "You will get well soon, Dick," said Oliver, his eyes filling with tears. "I will come and see you." "Goodbye, dear, goodbye. May God bless you," said the child, climbing up the gate and throwing his arms around Oliver's neck. Through all his trials and tribulations over the next few months, Oliver never forgot the blessing, the first he had received, although it was given by a young child. Oliver ran for the first miles, hiding behind hedges now and then, because he was afraid that the workhouse officials would be looking for him. After he had gone 5 miles, he sat down on a milestone and considered his position. He had a coarse shirt and a pair of darn stockings in his little bundle. Also, he had a penny that Sowerberry had given him once as a reward for being a good mute. He glanced down at the milestone. It said that London was 70 miles away from that place. London. Should he go there? He knew no one and didn't have a clue about what he would do once he reached. But he had heard some old men in the workhouse say that no one ever starved in that great city. He would go to London. Oliver began walking, and he covered 20 miles that day. At the end of it, he was footsore, weary, and famished. He had already exchanged his penny for a loaf of bread, and it was long gone. He tried begging for food at the inns, but was driven away. In some towns, he saw notices warning beggars that they would be thrown into prison. He trembled. He lay down under a hedge that night, curling up into a ball and trying to keep warm. He fell into a deep sleep, but woke up feeling stiff and cold. He was hungrier than ever. Oliver might have gone his mother's way, falling dead upon a highway, if a turnpike man and an old woman hadn't taken pity on him. The turnpike man gave him half a loaf of bread and cheese. The old woman fed him because she was reminded of her grandson who was missing after a shipwreck. A week after he had started, Oliver limped into the town of Barnet early in the morning, dusty and with his feet bleeding. He sat down on the steps of a closed shop and looked around. The town was just beginning to stir. Although people passed him and gave him some curious glance, no one stopped to inquire. Coaches clattered past, and Oliver thought with wonder at how they covered in a few hours the distance they had taken him a week. Oliver saw a strangely dressed boy staring at him across the street. He was slightly older than Oliver and ordinary looking, stout and with eyes set close together. But he was dressed like a man. He was wearing a long coat and a top hat. It tended to fall over his eyes, but he straightened it with a twitch of his head. When he saw Oliver looking at him, he came over. "Hello, my young friend. What's the matter?" he asked jauntily, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. "I have been working for 7 days," replied Oliver. "I'm going to London." "7 days? Know anyone there?" "No." "Have any money?" "No." The boy whistled in surprise. "Hungry?" "Yes." "Well, come along. Let's eat. I am hungry too." Hauling Oliver up, the boy, who said his name was Jack Dawkins, led the boy to a shop where he bought ham sandwich. Then he entered a public house pub where he ordered a tankard of beer. Sitting down at the table, he motioned Oliver to eat. After Oliver had gratefully swallowed the generous repast, Dawkins resumed his questions. "Do you have a bed for the night?" "No, I haven't slept in a bed for a week." "No worries. I know a respectable old gentleman in London who will give you lodging and food for free." Oliver was a bit astonished. "Really? Do you live with him?" "Yes," said Dawkins. "Come along. I'll take you there." Oliver agreed to go with him, although he was not comfortable with Jack's appearance and manners. Maybe the gentleman wasn't to blame for Dawkins' character. He was also puzzled by Dawkins' nickname, which he announced proudly as Artful Dodger. His newfound friend wanted to wait till nightfall before they entered London, so it was past 11 when they finally arrived in that great metropolis. The streets through which Dodger led Oliver were dirty and mean, crowded with drunkards, irritated women, squalling babies, and children playing in the mud. They stopped at a house at the bottom of Great Saffron Hill near Field Lane. Oliver hesitated, wondering whether to make a run for it, when Dodger pulled him into a dark and dingy passage and shut the door after them. "Who's there?" asked a voice in reply to Dodger's whistle. A man lifted up a candle at the end of the passage. A broken stairway led to what was probably the kitchen upstairs. "Plummy and Slam," said Dodger. It was obviously a code. "Who's the other one?" "A friend." "Where is he from?" "Greenland." "Is Fagin upstairs?" "Sorting the wipes. Go on, quick." With that, the man ducked under the stairway and vanished. Dodger continued up broken the stairs, holding Oliver with one hand. He pushed open the door of a back room and went in. Oliver saw a large room whose walls were black with age and dirt. There was a fire at one end, before which was a table with a candle burning on it and a loaf of bread and some butter on a plate. Seated at the table were 4 boys of Dodger's age, playing cards. They were smoking long clay pipes and drinking alcohol with the air of grown men. On the floor to one side there were rough beds made of sacking. Near the fire stood a very old wrinkled Jew wearing a shabby gown. He was tossing sausages in a saucepan which was suspended over the fire by a string. When the 2 boys came in, the Jew turned, and Oliver saw that he had a vicious and ugly face topped with greasy, matted red hair. He was dividing his attention between the sausages and a clothes horse on which hung a large number of silk handkerchiefs. Dodger went up to him and whispered something. The other boys crowded around Oliver. "Fagin, this is Oliver Twist, my new friend," said Dodger. The Jew smiled and bowed. "We are very glad to see you, Oliver. Very. You are welcome to stay here," he said. "Boys, set Oliver a stool by the fire." The boys with pipes shook both of Oliver's hands very hard and pawed at his clothes. One said he would hung up his cap, the second was very interested in his bundle, and the third wanted to empty out his pocket so he wouldn't have that trouble later. They scattered when Fagin beat them with a toasting fork. Fagin noticed Oliver looking at the handkerchiefs. "Oh, you are looking at the hankies, my dear. We have just put them out to dry after washing them." "Ha ha ha ha," he laughed. The boys shouted with mirth at this. Oliver could not see what was funny, but smiled at the antics of the merry old gentleman. "Come, Oliver, it's time to eat the supper," said Fagin. Oliver was offered a glass of hot gin and water after a hearty meal. He drank it drowsily. He felt himself being lifted one to one off the shack's bed and fell into deep slumber.